So welcome. What we wanted to do in today's little video blog here is just informally chat here at British Columbia Council to give some of you members and so on who are wondering what's going on with all this talk of a feminist international assistance policy, a new fund for women and so on. And we have a couple of people at the office, Deb and Sarah, who were instrumental, I shouldn't say instrumental, but were participating in the recent discussions with the Minister People from Global Affairs Canada. And what we wanted to do, or I wanted to do today, was just quiz you guys a little bit about what you know in a kind of a I know you can't wear the hat, you know, that you are an expert on feminism and this is how it is. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to just have a conversation where we can inform members about more or less what's going on. So the background is that we have a feminist international assistance policy that's in place and it's ratified and it's, you know, it's happening and people are happy about that all around the world in Canada. I mean, outside of Canada. In Canada, what has it meant? Like, have we seen, what is the actual, has the money hit the ground? There's talk of a $300 million fund. What's the, how do you play out that policy? How do you make it happen? I mean, either one of you want to tackle that. By the way, maybe just a quick introduction in case people don't know. I think most people who are watching this would know who you guys are, but give us the lowdown as to who you are.
Sure, I'm Deborah Glaser. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst at BCCIC.
And I'm Sara Farid. I'm the National Coordinator of the Inter-Council Network of the Provincial and Regional Councils for International Cooperation.
And the context here, again, is that you're both immersed in policy discussions, immersed in what all of the councils have done to try and talk about feminism. And also, you went to the recent roundtable with the Minister, which I did not have the pleasure of attending. So it would be wonderful to hear about that as well.
Yeah, so at least wearing our organizational hats, we can give a little bit of an overview of what happened at the meeting itself that was held October 1st. But beyond that, I do want to make clear that it will be kind of personal discussion and we're not pretending to stand for all women and feminism in general or for either that council or the collective councils. So on October 1st, Global Affairs Canada had a consultation where members of Global Affairs came and were talking about a partnership for gender equality. And so this is kind of thinking out how they might roll out the $300 million that was announced at the G7 as a way to achieve the feminist international assistance policy.
Just to be clear too, this is Canada goes to we have a G7 meeting this year, which we had the presidency of. And then we announced that there's going to be $300 million that we're going to throw into it. But I think the overall amount here internationally was closer to $3.5 billion, right? I think it's pretty close to $3.5 billion for the entire amount. So this is the Canadian component we're talking about.
And this is very early stages discussion of, okay, what can this fund look like? What are the mechanisms for how it might be rolled out? What kind of projects should we be funding? Conversations like that. And so there were about, I'd say 20 people in the room, give or take, representing both civil society, but also foundations and some private sector representatives. And there was an introduction from Global Affairs and Asia Pacific Foundation, who was hosting the event, had an opportunity to speak, as well as the Vancouver Foundation. And then from there, we split up into 3 groups that were tasked with talking about and trying to come up with some, I guess, rules of engagement of what might the governance structure of such a fund look like, what might the programming look like, and then the final one, I believe, was around investment. Yeah.
So this is a very preliminary steps consultation on how the whole thing's going to work?
Very much so. I mean, it was just the 3rd meeting of 4. So they had a meeting in Ottawa, Toronto, and then Vancouver. And then since our meeting in Vancouver, there was a meeting in Montreal. And they were all, or at least the Vancouver one was a 2-hour consultation.
All right. What was your impression?
Or is there anything that I missed that you want to?
No, I mean, in terms of participation, it was interesting, the mix of participants there. I would definitely say sort of the breakdown was not what I expected. It was quite foundation heavy. It was quite private sector heavy. There were a number of civil society actors represented, some university actors represented, quite a large sort of contingency from the Asia Pacific Foundation. And I think one of the reflections that was received sort of from the Montreal consultations was it was very foundation heavy as well. So it's interesting who's coming to the table, who's been invited to the table.
This is a new trend too, isn't it? I mean, it's this attempt to move towards blended financing, not just work civil society, but work also with the private sector and where the money is.
Mhm.
Seems to be the recent trend.
I mean, it's also a move away from sort of assuming that the civil society or the philanthropic sort of community has any sort of ownership or exclusive ownership on the definitions or the practice of whether it's attaining gender equality or really in any sort of international, whether humanitarian or international assistance agenda.
Let me ask you guys that, because that kind of is the elephant in the room right now, is that you have Canada stepping forward, Minister Bibeau promoting a feminist approach, and who owns that approach? Because there's a long history here of civil society being the very ones that promoted that, right back through to the 1970s. So who gets to own this feminism label? I'm curious, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, as you know, we had a consultation within our own board before going to this meeting, and this question came up a lot. And I was actually surprised to hear that it came up from Kevin McCourt at the Vancouver Foundation, just in the opening remarks, saying, hey, feminism exists. It's been going on. Civil society's been very involved. It happens on the ground in very local contexts, and you have to consider those contexts. And so what we've heard from some of our membership and from other civil society networks and groups is that there is a little bit of wariness to hear or to see global affairs coming in, or any government entity anywhere really coming in and putting what might be interpreted as just a feminist label on work that could be business as usual.
Like greenwashing in the environmental sector, is that what you're talking about?
Right, which is sometimes called pinkwashing. Yeah, and so this came up quite a bit at in the opening conversation at our consultation. Sara and I were actually at the same breakout session at programming. So it came up in our session, and I believe in the governance one as well. I can't speak to the investment one, but it is something that has to be considered. And so there was actually, Sara brought up in our breakout session that there is a real value in before we decide how this money is spent and how it rolls out, let's be clear about the intent that Global Affairs has coming forward using this term. Let's create some very clear definitions, some guiding definitions that might be agreed upon by all players in the room, but also could be adaptable to local contexts, because that's going to change no matter where you are.
Let me put a bit of pressure on you too, and just ask you, do you consider yourselves feminists, and do you own the direction that this is going? And if you were going to spend $300 million yourselves as feminists, what would a feminist program look like for women and girls and gender equality? How do we even tackle this label feminism?
Well, I'm quite interested in answering that question. I speak here from sort of as Sara, not representing anybody, as Deb had sort of said earlier.
As a feminist?
Well, not as a feminist, but in terms I'm not seeking to represent anybody's perspective here, whether inter-council networks or BCCICs, but I think there's real value in deconstructing what is feminism. I don't know if I would consider myself a feminist according to who, and I'm uncomfortable with the label altogether. I think there's some great work that advances gender equality, opportunity, the promotion and preservation of the dignity of women and girls, that even the people working towards that end might not call themselves feminists. So what is the objective of using the label feminism? Is it about an impact? Is it about gender equality? Is it sort of a vogue term to use? Is it an agenda? What happens when somebody uses the label feminist and the outcome of such feminism is not what you anticipated or expected? Are you then not feminist?
Okay, yeah.
Right. So do I consider myself a feminist? I consider myself a person who works towards gender equality, who hopes to practice it, who hopes to promote it. I would be uncomfortable being labeled that, because also in some contexts being labeled that alienates and excludes me from communities that I perhaps would want to be working with. Right. So I personally would want to deconstruct that if I were to say I am working as a feminist for a feminist goal. And I would also encourage in that spirit for the government to be clear about its terminology.
Has the government been clear? There's a good question. Do you feel, you guys have been studying this, you've studied this deeply in the consultation process. How clear do you think we have a definition of feminism or an understanding of what it means? Is there something we can look to and go, yeah, here, they've been clear?
When I think of feminism, I think of fundamentally equality between the sexes. And so I consider myself a feminist for that alone. But you have to kind of think of the history of feminism and the multiple waves of feminisms. And while the focal point of how we engage in what we're quote unquote fighting for with each wave changes, to me, it's still kind of that fundamental equality, that advocacy for women's rights, for gender equality between the sexes. So in that way, it always, have we heard, I mean, I think when you're reading the Feminist International Assistance Policy, it reads very well.
Well, how does it differ? Like, how would a Feminist International Assistance Policy differ? How do you feel that it differs substantially from a foreign policy or an international assistance policy that might not use the label feminism?
Well, I think this is where we can get into some clarification around the intent, because the way I read it, I assume the intent is to, well, there's always this conversation about using a feminist lens across all ministries, all departments, so that if you were to implement some policy through some other development policy that's not a feminist international assistance policy, that you're looking at it in a way where it's targeting women and girls and making sure that their circumstances are changed so that they become equal. Basic sense.
Okay, to give her credit,
whether or not it's played out that way is.
Well, she's claiming that 90% of projects will have to address women and girls. These are huge numbers and significant shifts.
I think there's a question of how you do that and how meaningful is the way that.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly again, to take gender or feminism as a lens and feminism as a sort of a goal, there's certainly value in.
Look, let's just tell me with that too, because I've heard this a lot. Feminism as a lens to look at things through, and then feminism as a goal. Can you just explain that? It's particularly in the context of the SDGs, because this is getting confusing with Goal 5 being a goal, not a lens. So what are you talking about?
So I think, to me, the way I understand it in its most basic element, I mean, women and girls constitute 50, not like a higher percentage of the population. Yeah. If you're talking about goals to achieve, whether it's end of poverty or higher education or conflict resolution and peace building, if you don't take account the perspective and experience of 50% of the population, then there's something clearly ineffective about your goals, about your programming, about everything that that you seek to achieve, essentially, if you don't take into account 50% of the population. Yeah. So at its very basic level, it's just common sense. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, common sense, that doesn't always play out that way, because even our development and our aid systems are skewed towards the status quo. You work through existing networks. So yes, there's value in that. In gender equality as a goal or feminism as a goal, it gets, I think, a bit more complex and complicated.
And especially when considering how it plays out at local contexts.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, because one would assume that if you look at poverty, let's say we're working in international development trying to address poverty and poverty alleviation or eradication, most of the most effective and vulnerable people will probably be women and girls, right? Although there are other demographics around disabled people and mentally ill and all these other bunch of people in there. But generally speaking, as a target group, they're a big target group. But one of the things that I'm curious about understanding is, how does a feminist, like, this is maybe where I'm being a bit of a devil here, but does a feminist approach see them as a target group or as
participant? I think
it's kind of the what do we say, beneficiaries versus like the agents of the change. And they like you're saying, they have to be included in the decision making process and the entire from the beginning, from the design. And that means that they should be included in this initial consultation process.
Okay, so are they doing that? Like, here's the government, they're out there asking how to spend $300 million, and they're consulting with people. It seems like they're doing exactly that. And here's a question: how many feminist-oriented women and girls that were in the actual target group, or the group that we're talking about, how many were at that consultation?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. We never went around and self-identified in any sort of way. I think one of the challenges that we saw with the consultation, and that I heard from a few people, is that getting notification a week prior or a week and a half prior to a consultation makes it very difficult for many people to participate, particularly women, who are often the ones who have to arrange childcare and figure out what's going on and change schedules. we did not, I did not, I should say I'm speaking on my own behalf, I did not see any women that I know of that of Indigenous background or anyone from Northern or rural representation, and having consultations in Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. You're not going to target that community. You're not going to get, or I shouldn't say target, you're not going to include that community from on the kind of program development side of things. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed.
But also in terms of, I mean, this is as much as, you know, the SDGs call for universality, it's still very much a fund for working abroad, right? And even for organizations that are responsible sort of for getting the voice of those communities that we would be working with, there wasn't much there was no actually representation of those communities. And yes, I know it might be tricky and sensitive to sort of engage this early, but also my feeling is that this is going to be pretty cooked by the time it rolls out. And it actually just goes sort of counter what we were just suggesting, which is if you're going to have any sort of inclusive participatory process, it's at this stage that these voices are important and need to be included.
Okay, so but there's two messages here though, right? One is that people want this money to be spent. They want action on the ground to prove that a feminist international policy isn't just talk, there's walk, right? But if you're gonna walk, you also gotta spend money, you gotta move quickly. So where's the fine line here between a minister who may want to get some stuff done, roll it out, and a perfect process, which is participatory and does all the right people. And, you know, those are way slower processes. So where are we? Where should we be in this game as civil society? What should we be advocating?
I don't think participation takes time once you get the hang of it. I don't think that having even just space and time allowed for proper representation from the communities that you seek to be working with is something that's difficult even. I mean, we're in an age where communications technology is fantastic and really could be put to positive service in a case like this. But even as Deb said, it's being given sufficient notice so that organizations that do have the capacity to consult more broadly can do so.
Is that a role for civil society or for networks or groups like BCCIC? Is that something that we should be more pushy about to make sure that these consultations are happening in a way that...
Absolutely. I think we can be more pushy. I don't know if it's our responsibility to organize a consultation. I mean, it's been done before from the government where there have been online opportunities for consultation or multiple. I mean, and I'm thinking back to the International Assistance Review back before it was FIAT. There were multiple consultations and some were online, and there were multiple modes of engagement so that you could cast a broad enough net to hit as many people as you can. And then the only thing I was going to say before in terms of that inclusivity piece is that there was also, at least I got the sense there was a bit of trying to put the cart before the horse, trying to decide, okay, what projects should we be funding?
Right.
And that's not something that we as Canadians in a boardroom in Vancouver should necessarily be figuring out, even if we do work for a council that represents an organization that's doing work with the communities that are being targeted. Those communities should be part of the process of deciding what is necessary in their communities, what's priority.
And do the members around Canada, the councils, there's up to 400 members of organizations doing this kind of work. Do you think they're in a good position to roll out projects with this kind of an approach that's grassroots on the ground, consulting with people around gender equality?
I don't know about rolling out from beginning to end, but certainly they would have, first of all, comparative advantage and a lot of value in participating in the implementation or the peer review, or, you know, there's so many components to this where, I mean, they would actually probably be best positioned to offer their perspective and their experience and their relationships. Yeah, certainly. I just wanted to go back to the point you made earlier. It's interesting to me that there's so many other ministries that see their work as ultimately for the benefit for social good, like urban planning. Right. And they do these like public consultations all the time, and they're online consultations just to ensure that, you know, that a project will move forward with the user's sort of interest and with the reality of like usability in mind. So why wouldn't you have the same sort of concern for impact and efficacy in something this probably more sensitive in a way, right? And and costly in some cases.
Yeah.
So it seems to me there are examples within government that could serve as good templates for consultation.
Yeah, and very true. I wonder too, this overall, I mean, let's just assume that the idea behind helping the world's most vulnerable women and children and girls, and also particularly dealing with them as agents of change, like not helping and assisting them as agents of change is generally a good thing. But what is your opinion on this being, like, fads that come and go, right? Like a minister comes in and says it's all about agriculture. So people have their pet theory of change, and you come in, and now this theory of change happens to have been ours, actually, not this minister. So I think there's lots of evidence that civil society has promoted that having women and girls at the core and heart of international development is the key. That's a theory of change. Well, what's the possibility that this is going to disappear? We got an election coming up. Yeah, this minister could be gone in less than a year from now. What's the chances that this feminism orientation will stick and still be here a year from now if the government changes? Does it have its feet on the ground?
I mean, my sense is that is what they're trying to do. The answer is yes, of course, it's a risk. It's always going to be a risk that any new administration is going to change things. But I think by, first of all, requiring the integration of a gender lens across multiple departments, staying away from the question if it's being done in the right way, if that's feminist outcome versus feminism.
Yeah.
It's a thing that's happening, the establishment of the fund sooner rather than later, and trying to get that off the ground, I think these are steps, I think, to get it to kind of filter down to, out of the political range to the bureaucratic. And if we can get that done and get it embedded across ministries, that would help. Because it is a risk.
I do think, though, being at the consultation, I got a sense that there is an appetite, and there's an interest in pursuing, sort of, even whether it's the private sector or foundation, there is already an experience and interest in pursuing sort of gender equality goals. So it's interesting that way, because it could be a matter of, even if the new administration, if there is a new administration, it wouldn't necessarily have been its cup of tea and would have taken another approach. It would have to be responsive also to the public. Mm-hmm. So I think there is, and I don't know to what extent that it's the current government that instilled that sort of public interest and engagement. I feel that it's already been there. And it's curious to me what that sort of that common wave, and maybe it is a wave, but a common wave and interest in approaching.
Well, do you think it's a Canadian wave? Because I think we're seeing, like, we've got the Women Deliver conference happening here in Canada. That's an international thing. We've got a lot of focus on gender equality internationally. We've got the G7 is not going to be held by the French presidency next year. And he's already said, I'm underscoring gender equality as a key component. So how much of this is Canadian? Because it's certainly being...
It's not. I think it's pretty universal.
Are we leaders, though? Can we claim? I mean, we're so shy to do that. But at what point can we actually stand up and go, "Yeah, we're proud of Canada. We're doing a good job. We've got the only feminist international assistance policy. We're orienting a lot of money and capacity towards it." At what point do we just say, "Yeah, we're doing a good job"?
Well, this is where I think I'm uncomfortable with sort of the optics of feminism and the actuality of feminism. I think there are many countries that I would say are way ahead of us in terms of the sort of local policies and procedures that allow for gender equality and are feminist, and money spent without it being a sort of an announcement. And sort of what we're doing in Canada. Not to say that there isn't a lot to be proud of, and this is a really good direction, but I think there's a lot that we also can learn from the sort of domestic policies and international policies of many other countries. So it would be vital to make sure that the substance of the policy is what's admirable, and not just the optics of it, the labeling of it, and then sort of the announcement of new funds.
Well, let me dig a little bit here too. Can a country stand up and increase its defense spending by 70% and buy a $4.9 billion pipeline, for example? Can it do things like that and also call itself a feminist and not increase ODA? Like, this is the critique that's out there, is that we're spending money on a lot of stuff that looks like it's power and politics as usual, and pretty patriarchal too, to be dead honest. Can we do those things and also make the claim at the same time that we're feminists, that we have a feminist international assistance policy, and also watch our numbers go down in terms of ODA spent. I mean, this is the elephant in the room on this.
Well, this is one of the things that I did raise in the consultations. What happens if engaging women and girls in a particular community, let's say Guatemala, where that actually happened, and women become part of the decision-making process. They're given voice, they're empowered to participate sort of in the decisions around economic development of their community, and they say no to the extractive sector. Right? Then would that sort of outcome of feminism be something that Canada's comfortable with?
Yeah.
And will it respond accordingly? And this is me oversimplifying sort of the equation here, but then it's curious to me what happens. Is that the kind of or will it come to a point where it's like, well, feminism until it sort of goes against our sort of understanding of national interest and national security? Right? So there does need to be some sort of a coherence, and there actually needs to be some thought put to the risk of unintended outcomes or undesirable outcomes out of pushing a feminist agenda, and what that means and how that's interpreted on the ground.
Listen, I'm going to leave you with one final question, because I think we could talk all day about this stuff, and it is interesting. Hopefully it's informative to people that are watching this. The reason we're doing this is because we think sometimes we have these conversations at work, and wouldn't it be beneficial if people could at least listen in, because you guys get a pretty good in, and so do I, going to policy meetings and so on, in terms of being able to understand where people might be at. Which brings me to my last point, which is just that we have the overall HLPF work that we've been doing and the SDG framework that we've been looking at. How would a feminist look at those other goals? How would a feminist lens look at these other goals? What are the things that we could be advocating for in terms of, if we're going to wear the feminist hat, how do we approach the SDGs as a whole rubric?
I think it goes back to this conversation that we always have around focus versus lens. And just to get away from gender for a moment, last night we had our upcoming youth delegation for COP24 in the room, and we talked about this in terms of all the negotiation streams that are going on in COP. We're looking at it through a climate lens. So we're not disregarding issues around forestry in SDG 15 or issues around Indigenous rights and knowledge in SDG 10. We're looking at those things, but we're, for the purposes of this meeting and the negotiations going on here, we're looking at it with a climate lens, but recognizing that you can't talk about one without the other.
Yeah.
And I think for me, it actually boils down to participation and the rights to participation. I mean, ultimately, again, it just goes back to 50% of the population can't participate or hasn't traditionally participated in decisions that govern and determine its own choice and opportunity in life. So I think that's also the strength of a feminist lens, and it doesn't only look at gender, but it looks at who else is excluded, who needs to be part of these decisions, where the gaps might be in participation in decision making.
Yeah, certainly there seems to be an emphasis. I know the Women Deliver but theme for a discussion about gender next year will be about power. It's about exactly this. It's about power. What are the opportunities, just in case people are stimulated by this conversation and they want to be more involved in the discussions, what are some of the opportunities that members or individual members have? We have Women Deliver coming up. We have IDW has a focus this year, I think. International Development Week will have a focus on gender and equality as a lens, right? What else have we got?
I mean, the Partnership for Gender Equality is still, it's not set yet. We've just wrapped in-person consultations. There's going to be a paper coming out around what we heard, but there's still an opportunity to provide input into the process. And that's something that if you reach out to us at BCCIC, they distributed a kind of a questionnaire at the end. So we're
and you're trying to compile some written commentary as well, right? To be able to put in, so people have, how would they find out or look at the questions? Do you have some lists of questions that have been asked?
There were the questions that were sent out ahead of the roundtable conversation, and then afterwards there were some follow-up questions around, how could we best do this? How could we best do that? So there is room for input.
Okay, so just to get it right, that's the $300 million fund.
That's just the $300 million.
Yeah, there's still the Feminist International Assistance Policy.
Well, and I would say for organizations across Canada, participation in the work of the councils and the capacity of the councils to take sort of the voices of members and affiliated individuals and interested people, and put that collectively, thoughtfully, and make something out of it. And
can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Are all the provincial, there's 8 provincial and regional councils in Canada, do they have a cohesive understanding of where they stand, or is there a need also for us to be talking amongst ourselves as to what exactly is a feminist international approach, international assistance approach? Like how much do we have our own kind of understanding together?
Well, I mean, there would be also a question about how much do we need to have sort of a solid and static understanding of feminism, right? Because the councils represent a diversity of organizations. So certainly that wouldn't be feasible if they were to be doing their job properly as a network that represents a diversity of organizations. But also maybe there needs to be space for flexible and dynamic and different understandings. And knowing how people relate to that. I think the need is to understand what this agenda is, and then people sort of can determine what their programming looks like, what their own values and identity look like vis-a-vis that.
Well, maybe one concrete way is there's definitely also a lot of talk right now about how to approach sexual misconduct in our sector, right? So there's some places there that people can get involved directly.
And there are really good existing models out there of organizations in Canada who use kind of a feminist approach to the work that they're doing, both in the field but also in the workplace. And that does feed in. I think you brought that up, the final part, because we at BCCIC are putting together a kind of gender policy and a sexual harassment policy that I mean, it is a struggle. There are a lot of models out there, but it does boil down to, okay, first you have to kind of have a concept of what feminism is in relation to your organization. What does it mean? And does everyone agree with that? So that's something that we're dealing with right now. And when we do have either a draft or a final of the policies that we end up developing, we do hope to use it as kind of a training for our sector, so that if people want to adapt it to their own organizations, their own networks, that they'll be able to do that.
All right. So if you were in an elevator just going out here right now and somebody asked, is the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation, or the ICN, a feminist organization, what would you say?
Well, a lot of what you were saying kind of raised a lot of questions for me. And okay, well, what is feminism? So if we wanted to stay away from that, I would say that BCCIC is an organization that strives to support gender equality, both in its own work environment, but among its network and their work environments, and promotes those issues. And we are trying to figure out what feminism means, what in the context of our organization, and how we use that label. Not how we use the label, but how we adopt, because it's not just, that's the thing, it's not the label that we want, we want to adopt the movement, perhaps. It is an existing movement, it's been there for a long time. We're not pretending to come in and say, hey, we're feminists, this is what feminism is. Do we want to join this existing movement? And what does that mean for us at BCCIC?
What about the ICN?
I really appreciate the language that Deb just used, and I would probably echo it.
Okay. Well, good. You know what it sounds, just to end this, then it sounds like, I think an organization which is exploring this talks about it and has open discussions, which is the exact spirit of what we're trying to do right now, which is have an open discussion about what does this stuff mean? What is the terminology that's being used? Be a little bit humble about our own approach, about whether or not we're befitting of the term feminist, and doing a good enough job on that impact side. So hopefully you're interested in that, and you will contact us, or even just have the damn conversation yourself in your own organization. That'd be great, wouldn't it? If we just all talk about this more. So hopefully that served you guys, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.